Thank you, Senator Seward. Senator Williams.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President. I start my speech with the following words from George Lancaster of the 4th Anti-Tank Regiment, and I quote, "Those who were in Japanese captivity are always an elite group. For those who were not, they are unable, even in their wildest imaginations, to understand what happened to us physically, mentally and above all else emotionally. Does one forget the pain, the degradation and the loss of comrades who would never have died if our treatment by our captors had been halfway civilised? I forgive grudgingly, but forget? No. How ridiculous, how ludicrous." Tonight, Madam Acting Deputy President, I pay tribute to Allan Brideoake, a man who endured the horrors of a prisoner of war camp, and a man I came to know in the few couple of years as a thorough gentleman. Allan was born in 1920 in Cootamundra, the son of a farmer and later a butcher. He didn't know it at the time, but a young daughter of a family friend, Ruth Watt, was later to become his wife. After the Dunkirk evacuation in May 1940, Allan again asked his father if he would let him join the call-up. Mr Brideoake Sr. said he wouldn't stop him, but he also would not sign anything to allow him to join. Like many young men, he fudged his birth date, putting down the 6th of June 1919, 1 year earlier than the date he was born. He enlisted in the AIF on the 1st of July 1940 in the 2nd 19th Battalion, and in February the following year he and thousands of other young Australians sailed from Sydney bound for Singapore. The first few months were spent in Malaya, getting ready for what they knew would be a sustained Japanese attack. In an early battle, Allan received a bullet wound, and the bullet was not removed until much later when he was a POW. He recalled that life was tough, and one of his mates was so dehydrated he tried to drink the ink from a fountain pen. He was in Singapore when the news of the surrender came through on the 15th of February 1942. In Allan's words, "It was the beginning of the toughest period of my life. I had just lost a lot of good mates in battle, and I was about to lose many more, as well as witness some of the most barbaric acts of savagery by members of the Japanese army." Following the surrender, the Australians were marched 15 miles to Salarang Barracks near Changi. He soon got a taste of what was to come, having to sleep on a cement floor, although he found a 6-inch piece of timber that he tried to lie on. The prisoners were sent to work constructing a road that would lead to a shrine, and one Australian was given the job of driving a steamroller. Each morning he would get the petrol ration for the machine, but would either trade the petrol for food or store the petrol overnight in the firebox of the steamroller. Not a good place to put petrol in a firebox of steamroller, Senator Scullion. One morning the Japanese announced that they were not happy with his work and decided that they would operate the steamroller themselves. This presented a problem because there was a tin of petrol in the firebox. The Aussies kept well away that morning, and then there was an almighty explosion and the front end of the steamroller flew off. All the Japanese soldiers bolted, while the diggers had a good laugh. It took them a while to fix it, and meanwhile the driver was called up. He guessed his game was up, so he said goodbye, he had his goodbyes and went over to the Japanese. They told him they were putting him back on as the driver, as he obviously knew how to operate the machine properly. Allan suffered the first of his beatings in August that year when he was savagely beaten with a pick handle, and as he tried to protect himself, his wrist was broken. In March 1942, D-Force were herded into steel railway trucks, were told they were leaving Singapore, bound for Thailand. They eventually arrived at Tasawa camp and work started on the railway line doing embankments and cuttings. From this time until the end of June 1944 was just hard slog, moving from camp to camp and eventually to Konya at Hellfire Pass and on up to Hintok and Rintin camps. I will take up Allan's words again, Mr President. This was the hardest time of our lives. The work we had to do was heavy and included digging, carting away rock and moving heavy timber around for bridge construction. Where a cutting was needed for the railway, gangs of 2 were given a 16-pound sledgehammer and a long chisel. It was called the hammer and tap, where one man held the chisel while the other swung the hammer 100 times to drill the blasting holes for the Japanese engineers. After 100 swings you would swap places. Many of the blokes ended up with broken hands and arms until we fashioned a bit of timber to hold the tap. We had to drive the blasting hole 1 metre in depth into the solid rock, and then the Jap engineers would give us charges to ram. After the blast, we would then have to return and clear out the rock. This is how the cutting at Hellfire Pass was made. The workday started at 8 a.m. and often finished at midnight. Starved men suffering from malaria, tropical ulcers, dysentery, beriberi and cholera bashed within an inch of their lives while they virtually used their bare hands to build what we now know as Hellfire Pass. The men were looked after by Doc Hinder, and Allan Brideoake, being a butcher, had the job of sharpening his instruments. The line construction was finished in 1943 and in June 1944 the POWs were shipped south to Singapore and then on to Japan to work in the mines. Allan said there were already Pommy POWs working in the mine, and they were a great help to the Aussies in telling them what they should and shouldn't do to avoid a beating. The winter was horrific and the warmest place was down in the mines. This brought new challenges to stay alive. Once Allan and others were trapped for 28 hours underground by rising water with just a solitary lamp for company. Nearly all the guards at both the mine and camp were civilians, and a lot of them were trying to outdo each other, bashing prisoners. A good mate of his, Doug Craig, was carrying a bucket of ash on a side of cinder pole, and when he went to salute a guard, he dropped the pole. For this accident, Doug was made to kneel in the snow all night and literally froze to death. Allan was so incensed he provided evidence to the War Crimes Commission about the guard, but nothing ever came of it. In late July 1945, the POWs heard Allied planes more frequently, and the following months they were given news that the atomic bombs had been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. When the end did come, the POWs were wary what fate faced them, but surprisingly the gates were opened and the officers took control of the camp. It was over. American planes flew over and dropped food packages and newspapers. One could not imagine the thoughts of these men knowing that they were lucky ones who had survived, and they still had their sense of humour. A group of Allan's commandeered an old truck with solid rubber wheels and headed off down the road to find a brewery they had been told about. By this time, some of these blokes had revolvers in their hips and looked like they were in a Western film. When they found the brewery, they weren't allowed to take the beer and whiskey until they signed for it. So that day, Bob Menzies, Don Bradman and Ned Kelly signed for most of it, and off they went. The men were asked to send a simple telegram, safe and well in Allied hands, which would go to their family. By chance, Allan Brideake's brother Bob was serving as a telegram officer north of Darwin, and a colleague reached across and gave him the telegram Allan had sent and said, "You might like to be the one to send this through to your mum and dad." Allan Brideoake arrived back in Australia on the 18th of October 1945. He was met by his mum and dad, his sister and also Ruth Watt, who had also worked for the war effort in various ways. Allan and Ruth were married in April 1946 and had 2 children, Bruce and Beryl. In the post-war years they were involved in butcher shops, farming and the accommodation industry. In 1997 Allan and Ruth retired to Scone. Ruth passed away in 2007, and I'm sad to say Allan passed away early last week at the age of 95. I was honoured to have met Allan Brideoake and enjoyed chatting to him about his time as a prisoner of war, and extend my sincere sympathies to his family. I conclude, Mr President, with the words of George Lancaster of the 4th Anti-Tank Regiment. When I arrived home, I received 2 £1 sterling canteen orders, a handshake and a ride home. No counselling or other forms of assistance so readily available today. Go home and be normal, we were told. We did it, each to his own principles. Allan Brideoake, you're a great Australian.
Thank you.